Hi, I'm Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. This video takes a look at what listing brokers should do when listing broker receives an offer on seller's property and buyer broker has failed to complete blank 17B. Quick refresher on Form 21 or any of the statewide form purchase and sale agreements. Paragraph 17 is the paragraph where the buyer broker's compensation is negotiated between buyer and seller. Paragraph 17A is the blank where buyer broker should identify compensation, if any, that seller offered to buyer broker. Paragraph 17B is the blank that buyer broker should fill in, identifying the amount of compensation that seller will actually pay buyer broker at closing. The conversation in this video is, what should listing brokers do if the buyer broker has seemingly, obviously, failed to complete 17B properly? Now, here's the challenge in every one of these scenarios. I say seemingly, obviously, failed to complete 17B, but part of the problem for listing brokers is that you really don't know exactly what was going on in the mind of the buyer broker. What you do know is that you're looking at a purchase and sale agreement that has 17A filled in, and let's say seller did make an offer of compensation, so there's some value written into 17A, and then 17B is blank. It doesn't have a zero written in it. If it was a zero, then we would know that the buyer broker intended to negotiate a transaction for buyer where seller was not paying any compensation to buyer broker. It's entirely possible that that's what's going on. It may be that buyer and buyer broker have agreed that buyer will compensate buyer broker outside of the actual contract, the purchase and sale agreement contract. Buyer will otherwise compensate buyer broker at the closing table, not by having seller pay buyer broker's compensation. And for whatever reason, buyer wants to negotiate the transaction that way. That's entirely possible. And if that's what the buyer intends, then buyer brokers write a zero in 17B to communicate that clearly. But in our scenario that we're working through, there is no zero in 17B. Instead, it's just left blank. Seller's offered something, it's properly identified in 17A, and 17B is left blank. So what is listing broker to conclude from that? Well, a lot of listing brokers conclude that buyer broker made a mistake. Some listing brokers will, at that point, pick up the phone and call buyer broker and say, I think you made a mistake. Didn't you mean to complete 17B to ask for the amount of compensation that seller had offered? And oftentimes, buyer broker will say, oh my goodness, I can't believe I didn't understand the form, or I can't believe I left it blank. And they'll pull back the offer quickly. They'll fill it in. They'll have buyer re-sign the purchase, the offer, resubmit it. And then that's what gets submitted to the seller. But listing brokers, that's not correct. That is not what you should be doing when you receive the offer with 17B blank. Instead, remember who you represent. In this transaction, you represent the seller. And unless you're a limited dual agent, you represent the seller exclusively. You do not represent the buyer. You do not represent the buyer broker. Your interests, your duty of loyalty, run to the seller exclusively. And your duty of loyalty says that you shall take no action that is adverse or detrimental to seller's interest in the transaction. So think this through. Buyer broker has written an offer for the buyer, where seller offered compensation to the buyer broker, but the buyer is not asking for that compensation to be paid to buyer broker at closing. Now, in this conversation, we can all assume buyer broker made a mistake, and in many, many transactions, the vast majority of them, that's probably true. But as the offer is written, if seller accepts, seller will have no obligation to pay compensation to buyer broker at closing. So is it in seller's best interests for you as a listing broker to contact buyer broker and say, hey, is this a mistake? Don't you want seller to pay you compensation? Of course, that would be an action that is adverse or detrimental to seller's interest in the transaction if you make that phone call without seller instructing you to make that phone call. What you should do in every single situation first is talk to your seller. And you should explain to your seller what this blank 17B means to the seller. Seller, it means one of potentially several things. Let's assume that buyer-broker made a mistake and that buyer and buyer-broker both really do want you to pay the compensation you offered to buyer-broker at closing. If that's what they intended and buyer-broker made a mistake, you could accept buyer's offer as written, and we can hope to get all the way through the closing table without any change to the contract. And this transaction would close with you netting proceeds that don't include any payment to buyer-broker. That's best case scenario. What are some other possible options? It could be, seller, that we don't say anything to the buyer-broker now, and you get to the inspection contingency, and you have a buyer and a buyer-broker who by that point in time have figured out the error. Buyer does, in fact, owe compensation to buyer-broker. Buyer-broker and buyer were relying on seller to pay that obligation for buyer. Buyer-broker erred in drafting the form, and as a result, the obligation from buyer to buyer-broker is not going to be satisfied by seller, meaning buyer has an obligation they can't meet at the closing table. And so buyer terminates the transaction at the inspection contingency because buyer can't close the transaction as drafted and buyer figures that out. That's one option. I've gotten several questions from listing brokers who said, it seems to me like the buyer is terminating not because of any condition associated with the property, but because the buyer broker left 17B blank and they just figured it out. Well, remembering that buyer's inspection contingency allows buyer absolute discretion, sole discretion, to determine whether or not to proceed with the transaction, buyers have the ability to terminate the transaction in the inspection contingency, even if listing broker suspects that the reason for that termination is actually associated with buyer-broker compensation. So seller, we may have to address this issue at the level of the inspection contingency. Let's say we get past that point. Let's say we're approaching closing when the first draft settlement statement is delivered to the buyer and the buyer-broker. And that's when the buyer and the buyer-broker realize the error by buyer. And now we are days away from closing. We've had the house off the market for 45 days, and the buyer and buyer-broker realize buyer can't fund the transaction and pay the obligation buyer owes to buyer-broker. What's buyer going to do? Is buyer going to close the transaction without having this obligation to buyer-broker paid? Are we going to be negotiating this issue at the last minute at the closing table? Is buyer going to explain to the lender that they have this unpaid financial obligation? Is that going to impair buyer's ability to get the financing and even close the transaction? If buyer still has a financing contingency, will that give buyer an excuse for closing the transaction? Seller, these are some of the options or some of the potential outcomes in this scenario. And so, seller, I'm having this conversation with you now at the time that I'm presenting buyer's offer to you, and I need you, seller, to tell me what you want me to do. Do you want me, seller, to pick up the phone, call the buyer broker and say, was this a mistake? Do you want to accept buyer's offer as written or negotiate counteroffer to buyer's offer without addressing the blank 17B? What do you want to do, seller? And then listing broker, you follow seller's instructions. And once you've explained to seller the risks of accepting buyer's offer as written, if that is what seller wants to do, then listing broker, that's what you do and you go forward. I have heard, I think, every end of the spectrum in fact patterns since 17A and 17B came into existence. I've heard of sales failing at the inspection contingency level. I've heard of sales failing at the closing table. I've heard of transactions closing and buyer broker just not getting paid. I've heard of sellers telling their listing brokers to contact the buyer broker right at the very beginning before mutual acceptance and get the issue worked out now. Every seller is going to want to approach this issue from the vantage point that makes the most sense to seller, and none of us can assume what any individual seller is going to want to do. Listing brokers, that's why it's your job not to anticipate seller's decision, but to inform and educate your seller so that the seller can make their own decision, give you instructions, and then you act on those instructions only. If you have questions on this topic or any other, ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.